Okay, this video is about normal iron physiology, and it's going to be one of about 5 or 6 videos explaining how iron metabolism works, where it causes problems for you, and what you can do to avoid it. So starting out, iron is right here. It's a transitional metal, meaning it has a variable valence. It's most commonly 2+ or 3+. But the fact that it can change valence, that makes it more valuable for the human body. It can hand off electrons at the active sites and enzymes, but it's also problematic because when it goes back and forth between Fe2+ and Fe3+, that's called redox cycling, ferrous redox cycling. Those electrons can be given to oxygen molecules and create free radicals, reactive oxygen species, that can then lead to oxidative stress. And so that can cause lipid peroxidation, damage to plasma membranes, damage to mitochondrial membranes, damage to DNA, and cause sickness. So here's just an overview slide. We're going to look at this again later, but what happens with iron. First of all, here's your gut. You're going to absorb it. When you eat it, it goes into the proximal small bowel, into the duodenum, and then it's absorbed into the duodenal lining cells. The gut's called the enteric tract, so these are called enterocytes. And on the far side, so this is the luminal side of the duodenum and the enterocyte, and here is the opposite side. It's called the basal side, all right? And FP stands for ferroportin. So ferro is anything with FER. That's the prefix for iron from the Latin ferrum, for iron. So ferroportin, portin's like a door. So ferroportin is the door by which iron enters the human body. And once it passes through ferroportin, it's these little blue dots are the iron. It can then climb on board this little thing. It's like a kayak. Vernon Lewis, he's this famous hematologist. He calls it a kayak, a two-man boat. Other guy, Randall Lawfer, wrote a book about iron biochemistry, and he calls it a wheelbarrow. It kind of looks more like a kayak for our purposes. Bottom line is it can hold 2 irons. That's what you need to know. Hepcidin, hep produced in the liver, cidin to kill bacteria, that can block ferroportin when the body wants to lower its iron levels. Okay, so we're going to come back to all this stuff, but I'm just introducing you to the terms and what they do. So hepcidin blocks ferroportin from allowing iron to enter the body. Transferrin, trans to transport, ferrin, iron, is our little 2-man kayak, 2-iron kayak, and that picks up from ferroportin irons to transport them around the human body. They'll go to the bone marrow, which Vernon Lewis calls the blood factory. A good thing to call it. A lot of people call it that, and that's what it is. The bone marrow is a factory to make red blood cells and also to make other blood cells, platelets and your white blood cells, all the different types. A red blood cell lives about 120 days, and then it ends up in what's called the spleen, the red blood cell graveyard, which is the spleen. And basically, normal red blood cells about 7 microns, and capillaries about 5 microns, but the spleen has even smaller, tighter little sinusoidal capillaries that the red blood cells have to pass through. As the red blood cell gets older, it gets glycated, it gets stiffer, and harder for it to pass through there, so it can break apart. And only the young, fresh RBCs will make it through there. So at about 120 days, RBCs are removed from the circulation. This is a splenic macrophage. I drew it like a Pac-Man, and it's chewing up the iron molecules there to recycle them. And so this is the reticuloendothelial system, the macrophage system. It's just another spot where the iron goes before it's given back to the transferrin to take it to the bone marrow to make a new set of red blood cells. The liver is a major site of iron storage. And the iron is typically stored. This is just a magnified version of a ferritin molecule. So this is, transferrin is to transport iron in the blood. It only holds 2 irons. Ferritin is to store iron within organs, like in the liver especially. And it has 4,500. Okay, that's a lot of atoms of iron that it can store. And the liver is a major spot for iron storage. That's also why iron diseases often present initially with liver problems. Okay, so now we'll talk a little bit more. So why do we care about iron? Why is this such a big deal? Because iron is typically ingested by persons who've eaten a westernized diet in very excessive amounts, and they become iron overloaded with time. People do. And then it becomes a slow poison. And basically, Michael Skinner, the famous molecular biologist, he said that aging is being slowly poisoned. And that's a rather accurate statement of a lot of disease. So iron is another one of those things. In excessive amounts, our metabolism is not made to handle it. and it damages multiple organ systems. So we're going to learn a little bit of how does iron damage you and accelerate aging, and then once you understand it, again, it's relatively easy to avoid, but understanding it helps you to do so intelligently. Okay, transitional metal, variable valence, Fe2+. So Fe2+ is the Ferru, okay, and the OUS, it reminds me of deuce, like number 2 in Spanish. So that's how you can remember the 2 form, and that's in general considered the bad version of iron. That's not so important for our purposes. We're going to get into other more important details in a moment, but just so you've heard it. Fe3+, and then the eek, pronounced like eek, rhymes with E in 3, and that's 3+ iron. Okay, and it's going to go back and forth between 3+, 2+, 3+, 2+ all the time. Ferroportin, we just saw that. That's the door on the enterocytes so that iron can then get into the blood. So you're going to need to know that. Ferri, iron, portin is door, so ferroportin is iron door. Hepcidin, hep made in the liver, cidin is to kill something, to kill bacteria. It's made in the liver, and then it's also what's called an acute phase reactant. So when there's an acute infection or inflammation, the liver releases this into the blood. And the reason for that is, let's say you've got an acute infection. The way the body prevents the infection from spreading and growing is by sequestering iron. And so whenever there's inflammation, acute infection, liver will release this hepcidin. Cidin kills bacteria because it shuts the door. It shuts the ferroportin door so no more iron can come into the body. So we're good at that. It decreases absorption of iron that comes from plants. And it'll also prevent iron from being released back into the vascular system by the splenic macrophages. The one we saw that looked like the Pac-Man in that drawing, that chewing up the iron from the recycled red blood cells in the spleen. Okay, so that's the big thing hepcidin does. It decreases absorption of iron, kills bacteria by preventing them from getting their iron. Okay, next word is fibrinogen. Fibrinogen is another protein made in the liver, and it's also an acute phase reactant, meaning it goes up when there's acute inflammation or infection, and it sticks red blood cells together and into a rouleau formation, French word for stack of coins. That will also increase the erythrocyte sedimentation rate, another generalized sign of inflammation and infection. So that'll also make the blood a little more prone to clotting. Okay, so that's getting enough into sidetrack. I'll have a separate lecture in the future on hypercoagulability, but just be aware of this concept of acute phase reactants, things released when the body has an acute infection or inflammation. Okay, transferrin, we talked about that, TF. That's what transports iron in the blood. And like I said, Randall Lofer, he wrote a great book. Here's his book, Iron and Your Heart. And the main focus on that book was the relationship between iron and vascular disease. The other guy who has a real clever metaphor for iron is this guy. He wrote this book, Hidden Dangers of Iron. This is by E.D. Weinberg. These books are good, and these are all older guys who know a lot about iron chemistry. And those are the best books. Single author, on some complex subject. Usually some guy who did some great research, and they felt a little neglected through their life, so they want to explain it all, and they write really good books. Okay, we talked about Randall Lofer said it's like a wheelbarrow to carry 2 irons. Vernon Luke calls it a double kayak. What I liked about Weinberg says basically iron is like fire in your house. It's good in the stove. It's good in the furnace, all right? But it's bad anywhere else, and that's kind of how iron is. You want it where it's supposed to be. Anywhere else, it's real bad. Okay, these transferrins only hold 2 iron molecules at a time, and they normally should be saturated about 25 to 33%. When it gets above that, when transferrin saturation, that means almost more than half the sites are bound, then it starts not being able to hold on to the iron tightly, and you start leaking more iron into the blood. Free iron in the blood is called NTBI, and here's NTBI. That means non-transferrin bound iron. That's bad because then it can redox cycle. We'll have a picture of redox cycling coming up in the near future. And when it starts going back and forth between Fe2 plus Fe3 plus, those electrons are bouncing around and they can jump off and combine with an adjacent oxygen molecule. Now, ferritin is what we had in that last drawing of like the big multi-septated giant molecule that can hold 4,500 atoms of iron, okay? And the ferritin, again, is a great way for the body to sequester iron. So why would the body want to store large amounts of iron? Well, in case you have bleeding, you can replenish your hemoglobin, your oxygen carrying capacity of your blood very quickly. So that's a big reason for it. For our long time ago ancestors, it was hard to acquire as much iron perhaps as they wanted. Okay. So yeah, just the things we talked about again, because these are going to come up over and over again. Ferroportin is ferro-iron portin door to let iron into the blood system. Absorption in the duodenum. One of the things you'll see of these duodenocytes and pterocytes is when the body wants to get rid of iron and it's got hepcidin in the blood in high amounts blocking this, it'll just shed these duodenal absorption cells into the duodenum, and that's one way we get iron out of our body. Okay, we lose about 0.5 milligrams a day that way. It's a lot for us. Okay, we talked about transferrin, the little double kayak boat transferring iron around. And here's NTBI, non-transferrin bound iron, free iron in the blood. That's bad. You really want to minimize that because that starts causing all kinds of redox reactions and damaging tissue. You also have free iron in the gut. Normally you like iron bound to a plant food, because then they got something called phytates, and that keeps the iron from doing anything. All right, but free iron in the gut, when it gets down to the colon, that can cause redox cycling within the lumen of the colon, and that can damage the colon lining cells and cause cancer. It's a major contributor to that, and that's another reason why all these iron fortified foods are bad. Whenever you see iron fortified in something, don't eat it. Don't buy it for your kids. Stay away from it because it's going to have inorganic iron, free iron, and it's going to put that into your gut in large amounts, and that's going to lead to redox cycling of the iron, and with the generation of free radicals potentially damaging your colon lining cells, your enterocytes of the colon, colonocytes, increasing your risk of colon cancer. Here's that ferritin molecule, how Laufer said it looks like a giant Buckminster Fuller buckyball. The geodesic domes, you might have seen those at one time. There's some of them in Canada. They're kind of cool looking. Buckminster Fuller was a genius. Okay. All right, iron types, a couple things to know. Inorganic iron just means not bound to carbon. The word organic means carbon, basically. So organic iron is bound to a carbon molecule. These are usually bound pretty tightly, sometimes even called chelated. Chelation means like a claw to hang on to something. Usually it's to a big protein. There's also an intermediate form called ligand-bound iron, bound to some smaller molecule, and that's usually a weak binding. And those are at risk to potentially redox cycle. Nice thing about organic iron, it's tightly bound, let's say, to a phytate. It's not going to redox cycle. It's not going to do anything. That's what you want. So plant iron, here's the word phytate, and that's good. And plant iron, the phytate binding, it'll decrease the absorption of your iron. Actually, in the modern world, the vast majority of people, you want less iron absorption, okay? Meat iron is bound to heme, okay? And that's actually a bad thing because the body tends to absorb that in high amounts, and we're not able to regulate it even when we don't want iron on board. So that is not good for you. The more you study meat, the more you just see it just starts adding up the number of things that are bad about meat. I could give you 40 things, 40 reasons not to eat meat. It's much worse than is widely recognized. Okay, what does iron normally do in humans? Well, you need iron bound to hemoglobin, the heme iron, for oxygen delivery. You have iron bound to myoglobin, which is kind of like hemoglobin, but it stays in the muscle, a little bit of oxygen reserve for muscle activity. You've got cytochrome enzymes that also have a heme group, because the heme group is this big molecule with the iron in the center, and it'll resonate such that it can remain stable while the iron is handing off electrons in the active site of reactions. And iron is very important in a lot of enzymes to do that. It's very important for electron transport in the intermitochondrial membrane. Excuse me. Okay. Okay, so little things about normal iron. Here's about normal hemoglobin in a woman. It's a little bit lower than in a man. Hematocrits, just in general, you can think of it as being about triple the number for hemoglobin. Serum ferritin normally should be about 25 to 75 according to some people. Most of the time you'll see it listed as 25 to 300 being normal. Some of the iron biochemistry experts think it should be lower than that. In general, 1 microgram per liter of serum ferritin is about 10 milligrams of stored iron. That's not that important, but just so you've heard of it, that serum ferritin can be used as a way to estimate total body iron stores. Normal transferrin saturation should be, that's about the transferrin molecules, the kayak in the blood, should be about 30 to 35%. That's what you want. When transferrin saturation with iron goes above 60%, that's a problem. You start having more iron escaping into the blood, being non-transferrin bound, leading to these reactive oxygen species being generated. by redox cycling. So you don't want that because that can be an autocatalytic disaster that sort of amplifies itself. Okay, iron absorption. Our daily intake is about 10 to 20 milligrams. Ideally, that's what they're going to describe. And usually we absorb 1 to 2 milligrams of that if we're eating all plants, 10% of it. A man usually excretes about 1 milligram per day. And a premenopausal woman, it comes out to about 2 milligrams per day because she's menstruating. We desquamate some from the duodenal cells. Like I said, they can be sloughed off. About 0.5 milligrams per day. We lose some in our sweat. So if you want to get rid of iron from your body, which is a good thing for a lot of people, exercise more, sweat more, you'll lose a little bit more. It's still not as much as you'd want. A little bit in the kidneys, a little bit comes out in our hair. But that's really a fundamental problem with iron. Is it's much more difficult to excrete than one would expect. And I think that's because we're not made to eat meat. There wasn't any processed food in the past. So our bodies never were designed to have to need to get rid of iron. Let's see. And then as far as like how low do you want it to go, we'll talk about that a little bit in the future. Here's a graph of what happens to iron levels in people. So a premenopausal woman is this green line, and her iron stays relatively stable. She's taking in about as much as she's excreting from her body. She's going to lose iron if she has kids during delivery of the baby, also during breastfeeding. So premenopausal women tend to have relatively low iron levels, and that's thought to be very protective. You almost never hear about a premenopausal woman having a myocardial infarction unless there's some unusual circumstances, like she had a hysterectomy, she's 200 pounds overweight or something like that. Okay, so anyways, once she becomes postmenopausal, she's no longer menstruating, and now her body starts to rapidly accumulate iron. That's this green line here. And a man, as soon as he's done growing right here, boom, he starts accumulating iron very rapidly if he's eating a westernized diet with a lot of red meat, because that's got a lot of iron in it coming in through all that heme iron. You want your iron levels low. This is where you want them, right down here, like a premenopausal woman. That's the healthiest thing to prevent heart disease and a lot of other medical problems. Okay, we only excrete about 1 milligram per day. That can be a big problem because if you're eating meat every day, especially red meat, and then you're doing other things that accumulate iron, you're eating fortified grains or red wine, your iron levels are going to get real high, and that's going to increase your risk of cancer and myocardial infarction and heart attack. So we talk about it being excreted by shedding duodenal cells. We talk about sweat getting rid of some. Your skin is shed. That gets rid of a little bit of iron. Blood donation is the fastest way to lower your iron levels. We'll talk about that in the next lecture. Both men and post-menopausal women are only excreting about 1 milligram of iron per day. Let's see. And controlling the rate of absorption of plant iron is what we're designed to do. But we cannot control heme absorption that well, so that iron overloads us from meat. How to reduce iron levels, of course, it's sort of like, eat a low-fat, 100% vegan diet. The more you study this, believe me, the more obvious it will be. No processed foods, because lots of them are fortified with iron. That's very bad for your health. It's a bad type of iron, and there are excessive amounts. Exercise more to sweat more. Donate blood. We'll talk about it. Aspirin a day causes bleeding in the gut. So that's one thing a person could do. I wouldn't personally do that. I think there's other side effects from it. Some people think that one of the reasons why omega fats can have there's a lot of problems with omega fats. I do not recommend that, but I'm just saying that some people think they cause bleeding in the intestinal tract, and that actually ends up being beneficial as a way to get rid of some iron. But trust me, there's lots of problems with omega-3s. I've given other lectures about those. For women, allow normal menstruation. So if a woman's taking birth control pills for years on end, she's menstruating less, if at all, and she's going to be at an increased risk to have iron accumulation and increased risk. Iron accumulation is associated with increased risk of heart attack, increased risk of cancer. So, you don't want to be doing that forever. Hysterectomy prevents menstruation, increased iron load, okay? So it's not good for your health. All right, what causes iron overload? We talked about the meat having heme iron and how that's absorbed about 30 to 40%. So we end up absorbing large amounts of iron if we're eating meat, especially red meat. By middle age, most men eating a SAD diet or anything similar to it are very iron overloaded. Women start becoming iron overloaded in their postmenopausal sooner if they did the things we just talked about, birth control pills, hysterectomy, and all that. Plant iron is only absorbed about 10%, and it can be controlled and made less than that. and tightly binding to things like phytates, for example, in grains and in legumes and whatnot. They help us to regulate iron to get only what we want. Watch out for grains and cereals. They're routinely iron fortified. And I can remember when I was a kid, there used to be these cereals like Total and one of the other ones, they would brag about having 100% of every recommended dietary allowance, RDA. And I used to eat all that stuff and thought, wow, isn't this great? I didn't know any better. And the Raisin brands would do that too, put tons of iron in them. And I was probably iron overloading myself because I got my ferritin level and it was good, but it wasn't as good as I wanted it to be. I actually donated a little blood. I'll tell you about that in just a moment. Yeah, you don't want these things with the fortified with inorganic iron, not carbon-bound iron, because they're thought to increase your risk of colon cancer. All that iron going into your colon, redox cycling, generating free radicals, potentially causing lipid peroxidation of your colon lining cells. Not good. Watch out for these vitamins and these iron supplement things like Geritol. Iron's bad. You don't want more iron. You want less iron. I mean, unless you're some rare person who's anemic with low iron, and most so-called low iron persons really aren't that low. But if you actually are, get it checked by your doctor, and you might need to eat a little more iron. But the vast majority of persons in this country are iron overloaded. They're not underloaded, so to speak. Sometimes a woman will be unnecessarily put on iron pills when she's young because she had a little minimal so-called anemia, iron deficiency anemia, and she ends up taking them for life, becoming very iron overloaded. Watch out. Iron supplementation is, the vast majority of cases, not a good idea. People are poisoning themselves. I remember when I was young, my mom, thought vitamins were good. Tried to get us to take them, and I think she took one and they had iron overload. She ended up dying from colon cancer. We didn't know. No one knew. Like the stupidest thing you could do would be to, eat a big meal with red meat, tons of iron there, and it's heme iron. With red wine, also high in iron, high in alcohol, liver toxin. And then with fortified bread with all this inorganic iron, really bad for you. And then vitamin C, even though vitamin C has a lot of good things about it, in the context of high iron amounts, it reduces the iron from Fe3 plus to Fe2 plus, and that is more absorbed in higher amounts, so it makes it worse. Increased predisposition to iron overload. We talked about red wine being bad. All alcohol is bad. It's all bad for the liver, worsens the effects of iron toxicity on the liver. Don't eat off iron cookware. There was a problem with that amongst the Bantus in South Africa, and they were becoming iron overloaded because they were had a lot of iron cookware. Decreased menstruation. Anything that decreases menstruation increases a woman's risk of iron accumulation, including birth control pills will decrease menstruation. Hereditary hemochromatosis is much more common than is widely recognized. Repeated blood transfusion is a very fast way to become iron overloaded. Okay, and so that's it for this talk. I'll have iron part 2 lecture coming up in just a little bit.